somebody's house recently and they were using a regular cutting board to cut some bread, and the crumbs were going everywhere and it was a big mess. So I decided to make them a breadboard cutting board. It has these slats in it so the crumbs fall down to the bottom and the slats come out so you could just empty out the crumbs really easily. I hope they'll like it, and let's get started with the build. So I was thinking about what to do with this 5/4 piece of walnut, and then I saw this live edge slab and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I cut it up into an 18-inch long piece, and then I took the live edge and cut it at the same length. I'm not sure if this is a safe method or not to cut this wobbly piece just to put some shims behind it, but it worked. And then I sent everything on the sled through my planer because I do not have a jointer. And once it was flat on one side, I was able to send it through on the other side like I would normally send anything through my planer. All right, safety police, I am taking off my rings and I'm rolling up my sleeves. So I cleaned up the piece of walnut on the table saw, and then I wanted to make 4 pieces for the trim that were 1/2 inch thick, and for some reason, I guess maybe my caffeine didn't kick in yet, I decided to make repeatable cuts this way instead of putting a 1/2 inch space between the fence and the blade. So, alright, whatever, it happens. Now I wanted to resaw the board, but my bandsaw is not tall enough to be able to resaw a board this tall. So what I did is I just kept making these cuts, making the blade higher and higher, making sure the same face was against the fence at all times, and making sure I used a push stick and my hands were really far away from the blade, and raising the blade slowly until finally the pieces were in half. And it looks really cool like this. Instead of gluing it up as a book match, I thought maybe it would be cool to glue it up in this kind of like wave pattern. I don't know, we'll see. I thought it was cool. And it was a pretty standard, uneventful glue up. I just had to bring it inside so the glue would fully cure because it was freezing outside. So while that was drying, I got to working on the live edge that I was going to be using for the slats for the breadboard for the inside. And I used this little jointer sled kind of thing to cut off the live edge, and it works really well. I kind of really like it. Alright, so finally my caffeine kicked in and I marked the board to remember the orientation of the grain, and then I made repeatable cuts. I cut the board into thin strips. I love using this gripper for cutting thin strips like this, but let me pause to adjust it and show you guys how cold it actually was in my garage. So after I finished cutting all these pieces into strips, I realized I think I could make 2 boards out of this. So I marked the other sides of the strips so I could put the pieces back in order after I cut them up. And I just resawed those tiny strips into more tiny strips until I had 2 piles of tiny strips. There's 1 and there's 2. After the panel I glued up earlier dried, I sent it through the planer just to clean it up a little bit, and then cleaned up the edges on my table saw, and then took it to the router table and put a rabbet around all 4 of the edges. Instead of measuring for the border pieces, I just lined them up on the rabbet and marked off where they needed to be cut and cut them to size using my miter saw. Okay, now all my side pieces are cut to length, and now I want to put a groove in them to house the bottom of the board. I think it's a groove when it's going with the grain and a dado when it's going across the grain. Not 100% sure about that, so correct me below if I'm wrong. And I'm going to join the pieces using a butt joint. So this piece over here, the end is going to be covered with this piece. So making a groove all the way through is going to be totally easy, totally fine. This piece over here though, the end is going to be showing. So I need to make a stop cut, either with my table saw or router table. Not really sure which one I'm going to do yet, so stay tuned to see which one I decide. I referenced the rabbet on the panel to determine how deep the groove was going to be. Then I made a cut in a scrap piece and made the same cut in all of my actual side pieces as well. And then I kept moving the fence over and kept making test cuts on the scrap piece until I got to a fit that I was happy with. And once I got that fit I was happy with, the fence was already in the correct position to create the correct size groove on all the rest of the pieces, and I could just run them through and it fit great. And now for the stopped groove. If you guessed I was going to use the router table, you are right. So it was pretty simple. I just had to mark off lines where I wanted it to stop and end, and that was where the gap in the back fence was. Since the groove I needed was just slightly bigger than the bit that I had to adjust the fence a little bit. I used the groove that I had made earlier on the table saw as a reference. That was the correct width. And I just moved the fence a little bit away from the bit to create a wider groove in the board, and it worked really well. really happy with how the stop groove went on the router table. So since this is a solid board, it's going to expand and contract this way with the different temperature changes. So I'm just gonna put glue over here at the top and the bottom, not on the sides. And I left some room in those grooves for it to expand and contract. I'm not really sure if this is going to work out. This is just a prototype, and it's a good thing this is going to family, so I'm going to be able to keep an eye on it. Let's see. I needed a way to reinforce the butt joint, so I thought dowels would be easy, and I was wrong because I didn't have the right size dowels, and I think they were too big for this stock, and I drilled, the holes were just too close to the edges of the workpiece, but I'm just gonna show you anyway. Oh, this is probably like cringeworthy for some woodworkers out there. It's way too close to the edge. The dowels are way too big for the workpiece, and I was just in a rush and my kids were home and I did not want to run out to the store. So I just went ahead with it. See, I only put glue in the center of the board there, thinking that maybe when the board expands and contracts, it'll just stay in the center and it'll have room to move on the sides. That is my thought process behind it. I don't know if it's actually going to work like that. So I just continued with the glue up and, oh, look at that squeeze out. And I cleaned it all up, and then I used one of those band clamps to tighten it all up. While that was drying, I got to working on the slats. I trimmed them up at the table saw, and in order to measure for the supports for the slats, I just put them in the tray and measured the distance from the top of the slats to the top of the tray, and that was the perfect thickness that I needed for those supports. And I just ran them through the table saw and then marked a spot on my sled and put a stop block and cut them all to length so they would perfectly fit inside the boxes. Then it was time to glue up the slats. So in order to glue them, I made these spacers. In order to get the correct thickness of the spacers, I measured how big all the slats were together and then measured the whole inside of the tray and then subtracted that number and then divided that number by how many spaces there were to get the correct thickness. I ripped that thickness through the table saw and then chopped them up into little pieces at the miter saw. So this was definitely a learning experience with this glue up. The first one was a little bit difficult for me. I did it like the top way. I put the slats on top. And the second one was way smarter. I did it upside down. That way I only had to worry about gluing these 5 pieces. 5, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah. These 5 pieces instead of having to individually glue all the slats the other way. And these bandy clamps are really great for this kind of glue up. I only wish that I left the spacers in. I don't know why I took them out. And I was very happy. There were some slight imperfections in the corner, so I used glue and sawdust to fill in some of these tiny little imperfections, and it worked out pretty well. I also decided to use some brad nails to reinforce the tray. I was just worried that the glue wasn't strong enough. And I did a ton of sanding on this project, but I'm not going to bore you with watching me sand. It was time for finish. I use a mineral oil, and then afterwards I use butcher block conditioner, and I just love how this is looking. The grain in the walnut is just so beautiful. I added some feet to the bottom as well to lift it up off the table and for some grip. I love how the live edge just looks in this tray. I cannot wait to put this to good use. Well, here's the finished product. I'm really happy with how it came out, but I think the live edge board inside just looks really cool. I'm really happy with how both of them came out. I get to keep one too. So things I would do differently next time. I use butt joints to join the corners, and I was only doing that because I wanted it to be easy, and this was really just like a proof of concept. So next time, I think I would do miters and reinforce it somehow. I'm curious to know what kind of joint you would do if you were to make a board like this. Let me know down below. Another thing I would do differently is the panel. I don't think it was so necessary to use solid wood. It's what I had, but I think plywood might be a better option. That way I could have glued all the way around the corners and not just the tops. I think I might have even used too much glue. I'm a little bit worried about that. So plywood I think would be better. You don't even see the wood in here really. So I think plywood is the better option for something like this. And another thing I would do differently is sand all of these pieces before assembling them. That was a big mistake. That was not so easy to do. And while I'm talking about this, maybe next time I would join them with half laps. I think that might be a better option. So that way they just like snap right into place and I wouldn't have to use brad nails to secure them. So yeah, those are the things I would do differently. And now let's see this thing in action.
You're so busy, right?
I'm so busy.
I mean, what's A-L-O-L?
Hello?
Alon. You're right. Alon. Sing the funny songs.